Good afternoon and welcome to this Supply Chain School Lunch and Learn session on net zero and carbon offsetting. My name's James Cadman. I'm going to be your host facilitator for the next hour or so. And hopefully you should be seeing my screen right now. Excellent, thank you. I'm going to be taking you through this lunch and learn for the next hour or so. We are going to be using a variety of different systems, including Mentimeter, for example. I'll go through that in a minute. And we're going to get into the detail of what carbon offsetting and net zero mean. Okay, so today's lunch and learn, the overview, putting it in some context. Why are we reducing carbon down to net zero? What are we doing this for? What's the target? What's the response and the progress? And then some information on how we actually go about reducing carbon and what do we do with any residual carbon, any hard to decarbonize carbon. And this is obviously all in good timing for COP26 later this year in November. So why are we reducing carbon? There's a couple of graphs in this lunch and learn. I do like a picture, it says 1,000 words. This one simply makes the connection between temperature rise that's happened over the last 150 years, 160 years since the Industrial Revolution, that the global average temperature has risen by over 1 degree, something like 1.1, 1.15 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. You might say that 1 degree isn't very much of a rise, and actually it's quite welcome on a colder winter's day, but as a global average, it does have an effect. This small change has a really large effect on global weather systems and a long-term climate trend. And importantly, the further north or south you go away from the equator, the starker, the more extreme those changes get. Then the 1.1 degree is an average. They are 4 or 5 degrees or higher in the Arctic, for example. So what does this mean? We'll have seen some of the impacts that have happened in recent decades, whether it's more regular flooding, forest fires, extreme temperatures in the Arctic, coral reef bleaching, extreme drought in parts of the world. Essentially, climate change is a multiplier. These things all happen naturally, but they're happening a lot more frequently, a lot quicker, and a lot more extremely than they would otherwise happen in pre-industrial temperatures. So there's a lot of evidence that connects the temperature rise, increasing carbon dioxide concentrations in the Earth's atmosphere, and what we see in terms of some of these outcomes, these impacts. So we're going to jump onto the first Mentee poll, so get your phones ready. The question is, does your organization have a carbon reduction strategy with targets? And it's a simple yes, no, don't know in development. So if I just flip my screen over, you can see that. I'm just going to open the voting for you, if I get the right button. You should now be able to vote, and you simply tick the box you want and submit. You should have radio buttons, and you just tick the one you want and then hit submit. It's all anonymous, by the way, as well, for anyone who might be slightly concerned about that. This is all anonymized. So we've got 200 participants, okay? You don't have to join in if you're unable to or you don't want to, but it's just a bit of fun and also gives us some interesting information for the supply chain school as well. So about half of you have voted so far. I'll give you another few seconds to make your choice. Don't sweat the answer as well. If you're not sure, just go with your gut feeling. So roughly half of you so far have got something, either you've got targets and a strategy or something's in development, and a few of you are unsure. That's fine. Okay, cool. Excellent, that's really interesting. That's good to know. As I say, it's helpful for us to look at that. What we've got 99, 101, 100, 110, something like that, out of 130 have got something in place. So that's really good. Great, thank you for that. We shall flip back to the slides. Okay, so what's the target? What's our response and what's our progress to date? So this, the second of my lovely graphs, comes from the Committee for Climate Change. It's from their 6th carbon budget, which came out in December last year, December 2020. And this interesting document that's really detailed and full of lots of good information shows us what our pathway is to net zero. How are we going to, as a country, get to net zero by 2050? This is part of the Climate Change Act. We as a country have got mandated legislation to be net zero as a country by the year 2050. How are we going to get there? So you can see the graph comes down. There's a nice curve coming down. The solid black line is what we've done already. So we've already reduced it from 900 to somewhere around 500 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. So just under half a reduction, it's about 40% reduction has already happened. And there's some very good reasons for that. But then you can see the dashed purple line is what our trajectory needs to be coming down over the next 30 odd years to 2050. And sitting underneath that are lots of high level sectoral plans for what we need to do in transport, in housing, in infrastructure, construction, manufacturing, energy supply, all these big macro sector levels. And that's what these steps are that you see beneath it. The CB1, 2, 3 are carbon budgets. How are we going to get there? What do we need to do? What's the technology we need? What's the legislation? What's the bundle of issues that we need to bring together? And increasingly, it's getting harder, of course. We've had the quick wins, generally speaking. So we're currently here, there or thereabouts, 2021. And you can see we're on course at the moment. We've made good progress against our targets to date, but this is when things start to bite a bit more. So as I say, the Climate Change Act is talking about net zero by 2050. So that's where there's overall no emissions of carbon on balance from the UK. Hence the word net in there. It's not an absolute zero. Scotland and Wales have got slightly different legislations because of the difference of the economies in those two countries and how they operate. But as you might have been aware, recently there was an announcement to have an intermediate target by 2035 of a 78% reduction against our 1990 baseline. That's already on the trajectory, but actually putting it as a milestone in legal terminology makes it a lot more rigid, a lot more useful in terms of driving that change rather than waiting until 2050. So in terms of the trajectory, that hasn't changed. This is all based on what the Committee for Climate Change proposed and recommended back in December. And it took till kind of April this year for that to get through into legislation. So that's where we're aiming for. On a wider global stage, I'm sure you've all heard of the Paris Climate Change Agreement that happened in 2015, ratified in 2016. This was one of the COPs as well. This was COP21, happened in Paris. Obviously, that's 5 years ago. COP26 is happening in Glasgow later this year. This one was monumental because they actually got agreement across pretty much all nations in the world on doing something about this. And this is where the notion comes from of keeping our emissions rises to no more than 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, or ideally no more than 1.5 degrees. And again, it comes back to that fact that I was talking about earlier, that those temperature rises might seem insignificant on a warm summer's day. An extra degree isn't that much, but globally it does matter. Basically it means there's a lot more energy in the atmosphere. There's a lot more heat buzzing around. It's got to go somewhere, either a thunderstorm or a hurricane, or it has to come out somewhere. It has to be dissipated somehow. So if we can minimize that temperature rise as much as possible, we can minimize the adverse effects of climate change, and therefore the damage from them, the repairs, but also the adaptations that we need to put in place to be resilient as a society against those. So this is why Paris keeps getting mentioned, because it was at that point that these trajectories were set for bringing down our emissions globally. Those are then devolved down to nations, to the UK, and subsequently at regional level where relevant, and therefore us working out, well, what do we need to do as a country, as an organisation to set our targets? What do we need to do as our contribution? I said some of those quick wins had already happened in the UK. That kind of 40% reduction that I showed you earlier, that solid black line from 900 to 500 megatons of carbon. A lot of that has happened, not all of it, but a good chunk of it has happened through the decarbonisation of our electricity grid. So whenever we plug something in, it's inherently less carbon intensive than it was. So this is another one of my graphs. What this one is showing you is the carbon intensity of the UK's grid mix. So whenever we pull electricity from the grid, it has an inherent amount of carbon embedded in it from the combustion of fossil fuels to create that electricity. So if burning coal, gas, oil, whatever's been consumed to create that electricity that's then put down pylons and comes out of our plug sockets. Back in 1990, we're looking at almost a kilogram of carbon dioxide was produced and emitted into the air for every kilowatt hour of electricity produced, for every unit of electricity. So it's around 900 grams. Over time, it's come down by about 2/3 to something around 300 grams. And there's been several reasons for that. We had the dash for gas in the 90s, where we started moving away from coal-fired power stations and having more gas turbine power stations, inherently less carbon intensive as a fuel for the same amount of energy coming out of that. That was done initially because of the availability of coal and the price of coal and all the other issues that go with that not so much about carbon, but it's a beneficial byproduct in our route to trying to get down to net zero as a nation. And then more recently, investment in renewables. I'm sure you've all seen, increasing investment in solar PV, in heat pumps, and offshore wind has been hugely invested in over the last decade or so. And then particularly this time last year, when we were all in the first lockdown and there was less travel and it was a warm period of year, there was no coal consumed at all in the UK's grid mix. So the emission factors, what people like me really focus on is the emission factor. What is the amount of carbon emitted for each kilowatt hour of energy released through that combustion? Fell off the scale. It dropped really, really low to about 140 grams of carbon per kilowatt hour. Due to the weather we had, but also the availability, the increased availability of renewables. So this is part of the story, but it's not the only part of the story. That's all scope 2 emissions in the jargon. We shouldn't forget about scope 3, and quite often scope 3 is our value chain, our supply chain. And as organizations, if we're looking to get to net zero, that's where the biggest challenge is. We will have, generally speaking, a lot more control over what our own organization does. It stands to reason. Our scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, we can decide how we deploy our resources, what we invest in, what machinery we buy, all as part of our budgetary planning. Scope 3, we have less control. We can decide what we buy, of course, but we have less influence over what is within that, what's embodied carbon within that product or service or goods that we are procuring. And the same as if we sell products downstream to our customers. We can tell them how to, or we can advise them how to use those products, how to run them efficiently, but ultimately it's up to them. So we have less control. We have more of an influential piece. So scope 3 should not be forgotten in this. Okay, second of our 4 questions. If you flip back to mentee, next question is: do you know what net zero carbon means? Yes, maybe, no. So if I just move on. There you go. That should come up on your screen now. You might have to click a button that says go to next slide. Excellent. So we're getting about 3/4 who are saying yes, and a quarter are saying maybe. Excellent. 6 are saying no. Excellent. Okay, cool. Thank you very much. That's really interesting. If I get any tough questions, I'll pick on one of the audience to answer them for me. Okay, still getting some lay entrants in. Excellent, 130. Cool. Okay, that's probably good enough. So you're getting a good spread there. That's really pleasing from our point of view as a school to know that people are getting to understand what net zero and these different terminologies mean. They're not all perfectly defined. There's still some discussion about what they exactly mean, depending on who you speak to, and I want to give you a flavour of some of that today. But part of that journey as we work through this and people understand, well, what do we mean by this? And it becomes a common jargon, like scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3 are now well-defined terminologies that people use. We need to get to that position with net zero as well. Okay, so a few bits of terminology and jargon. I'm sure you've heard of carbon neutrality, carbon neutral, net zero carbon. They are similar. They've both got the word carbon in. They both talk about neutral or net or balance, but they are slightly different. Both are a zero sum balance between greenhouse gases emitted in one place and the same amount offset or sequestered or taken away somewhere else. But they have different boundaries. What's included is different between those two. Generally speaking, carbon neutrality, and this comes from the PAS 2060 standard, carbon neutrality generally focuses on an organisation itself, its own scope 1 and 2 emissions, what it directly owns and controls, plus its electricity and any business travel as well. And in PAS 2060, it does allow for offsetting in terms of you've worked out your footprint, you've reduced it where you can, and then you offset what's remaining. That's generally what carbon neutrality is meant. But as I say, do take this with a pinch of salt because these terminologies are still bandied about with a little bit of flexibility fraying at the edges in terms of what they mean. Net zero is generally taken to mean all scopes of carbon emissions. So not just scope 1 and 2 that you have more control over as an organisation, but also your scope 3 supply chain emissions as well. And how you can control those through what you're buying, what you're leasing, what you're using. And in the case of net zero, there's generally a move away from purely offsetting, and more focusing on really hard to decarbonize emissions. So being tougher on how much we can reduce our emissions before we even look to offset or sequester or decarbonize what we're doing. And in many cases, offsetting is not included in what is allowed in effect. There are various more precise or more detailed definitions from Carbon Trust, and science-based targets are also developing their own definition of what net zero means. And I'll show you the one from the UK Green Building Council in a minute as well. But essentially, it goes further. It's more inclusive. It includes the whole supply chain and value chain up and down from your organisation. It talks about really working hard on reducing your carbon emissions before you even think about doing anything else. And when you've got to that point, then yes, you can think about an offset or ideally a decarbonisation, reducing and removing carbon in absolute terms. And I'll come on to the difference between those two in a minute. So as I say, the Green Building Council have got a published definition. I'm sure some of you have seen it in terms of net zero carbon in construction and then in operation. So first of all, if you're building the assets, the house, the building, whatever it is, there's a definition there on how you calculate net zero up to the point of commissioning that asset and handing it over. You know, practical completion is the terminology they use there. And then balancing any hard to decarbonize emissions through offsets or exports of renewable energy. And then there's an analogous definition for operational energy. When you come in as the owner and you're managing that facility, there's a definition there in terms of how you operate that facility. And you'll see here already that there's a bit of a slight difference in terms of how offsets are treated versus carbon removals. But essentially, it's looking up and down your value chain. So with the construction piece, you're thinking about all those materials that you get from your suppliers and contractors, the embodied carbon in those Scope 3 emissions, the transport that's associated with them, any waste on site that's taken away for processing. That's all Scope 3, that needs to be included. It's not just the Scope 1 and 2 on your site. So in summary on that, to be truly net zero, you do need to consider everything you have an effect on. You need to do a materiality assessment, understand how significant those different aspects are, how easy is it to get the data for them if you're going to go off and measure it, how reliable and robust that information is as well, and what it contributes to an overall understanding of your impact. And as I say, it's both your upstream and your downstream, depending on your position within the value chain. And just to give some idea of numbers on that, we know of contractors who've calculated emissions in their value chain, and they can be up to 99% of their overall total emissions. 99% can be in their supply chain. A typical house builder will have 2/3 of their emissions in the supply chain from all the materials obviously that come on site, and then the other third, basically the balance, is the home owner, occupier, who's then using the house, as we all do, lights, heating and so on. And the actual house builder itself has got a very thin sliver in the middle of all of that, 1-2%. So if you're going to get a comprehensive assessment of what you're trying to do to get to net zero, you're going to need to think about value chain and supply chain as well. I've just seen a question, is carbon offsetting a dead end? We'll come on to that in a bit. Stepping stone is probably a better metaphor for that. So when we're doing what we're doing, we are all ultimately following the trajectories of the Paris Climate Change Agreement. Even though we might not be explicitly thinking about it, we are ultimately trying to bring down our emissions as close as possible to zero. Science-based targets is one key thing as well, one key mechanism for doing that. It's slightly different to net zero. We need to be clear, it doesn't mean net zero, and hence why science-based targets are developing their definition of net zero as well. Science-based targets means reducing, but not necessarily getting to zero. It's bringing them down in line with Paris, but they are closely aligned, I should say. Word of warning, as I say, out of all this, various terminologies being bandied about: carbon neutral, carbon net zero, climate neutrality. You'll hear various different versions around, especially when you read articles. So do go in with your eyes wide open, have a pinch of salt to one side. Do check when you read the detail, is an organisation talking about its own operations, its Scope 1 and 2 effectively, or is it also including its supply chain, its value chain as part of that? We have seen many articles where people are claiming carbon neutrality, or they will be carbon net zero by insert date. and then when you read the detail, you realize it's really just their offices, their facilities, their own depots. It's nothing to do with their supply chain. So just be careful. It's not quite greenwashing, but it's not being as transparent as maybe as it could be. So do be careful. And then to the question I heard earlier, offsetting has a role to play with residual emissions. Offsetting does come with baggage, greenwashing baggage, but it is a viable mechanism. But as the slide says, it stresses that only after other actions have been taken. So don't leap straight to paying your way out of penury. Basically, it's a way of saying we've gone through our carbon reduction strategy, which I'll come on to in a bit, and we've done everything we can to reduce our emissions from our facilities, from our vehicles, from our supply chain, and we have a strategy to continue reducing that. It is a plan, do, check, act. You go round, like ISO 14001, and you're continually iterating and doing continual improvement. Offsetting has a role to play, or as I say, better still, decarbonisation for those aspects that you find really hard to decarbonise because there's no availability yet for the technology, or it's just ludicrously expensive at this stage, for example. There's a rather technical question about the Green Building Council definitions on the standard for EPDs 15804. I'll come on to that one separately because that's quite detailed. Okay, so how do we reduce carbon? I'm sure you'll have all heard about the waste hierarchy. No surprises, there's an analogous carbon and energy hierarchy. And this is used across organisations in their carbon reduction strategies and their net zero reduction strategies. If you can avoid using energy, avoid emitting carbon in the first place, then do so. If you can reuse existing facilities, existing aspects and parts of a facility, then do so. Thinking about all that embodied carbon that has gone into the fabric of that building or that asset, that is it's kind of being wasted in effect if you have to demolish it and use it elsewhere. I understand there's obviously tax implications, VAT implications when you consider new build versus retrofit and refurb. That's something else that should be tackled, but that's outside the science in effect. That's a fiscal policy that should be addressed. Of course, in many cases, you can't avoid using energy and releasing carbon. You need to do some works, but you can be smarter how you do it in terms of your design and your operations. Be more efficient in the materials and products you use. Use more low carbon materials. Think about the behaviours that go with it as well. It's not just the materials and the equipment. It's the behaviours, how we use this. You know, thinking of lean, thinking of off-site, modern methods of construction can really contribute to this as well. Where possible, switch to low carbon and renewable sources of energy and materials. Those materials that have been manufactured with less energy, it might be the same material, but if it's been manufactured in facilities that are more carbon or less carbon intensive, then all to the good. And thinking about on-site sources of renewable power, there are increasing numbers of plant and equipment that have got renewable power as part of their energy provision. And then finally, as a last resort, compensation and removal. So compensation is another word for offsetting, but then removal as well, which is the actual absolute removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, other greenhouse gases as well. Getting a carbon reduction strategy. So there's some very simple steps here on your route to net zero. And this is about carbon measurement and reporting as well. So it's part and parcel of the same thing. You need to understand what you're including in your net zero reduction strategy. You need to set your boundaries, what you control, what you don't control. You need to understand what your baseline year is that you're comparing against. So that's really important to set that out. Also, the goal of why you're doing this. What is the point of doing it? Is it because your clients are asking for it? Is it because there's a regulation that is driving you to do this? Is it something that you'd like to report annually? There's a variety of different reasons why you might be actually doing this. Going out and measuring, getting that baseline data, measuring your footprint, gathering all your activity data and understanding where you consume energy, where you release greenhouse gas emissions, and ultimately from that, identifying hotspots, because those are the things you're going to go for first of all. You know, maximize your efforts and get the best bang for your buck in terms of your activities. have an action plan, put those in place. Many organisations are doing this now as part of their drive towards net zero. Where can they act on first? What are the bits that provide them with quick wins as opposed to those that take a bit more time and a bit more investment, a bit more innovation maybe. And when you've gone through all that, then you can think about the offsetting and removal piece, as I mentioned, but only after all those other actions have been taken. And then finishing it off, you should have some reporting mechanism and some review process. What are we going to do next year? What's the next level of activities that we need to undertake? So I'm not going to read through all of these. As I say, you'll get the slides at the end and you can have a look through some of them. And it's not exhaustive by any means. Climate change and carbon, there is no one silver bullet. It's not like the ozone hole that we had a few years ago in the Montreal Protocol, where we could say, let's ban CFCs and problem kind of solved. There's a lot of different ways of dealing with carbon, and there's just a few examples here on the next couple of slides. Thinking about the equipment and the transport we use, thinking about moving to lower carbon and zero carbon alternatives. There's a great article I saw the other day about a hydrogen powered car that managed to do over 600 miles on one tank of hydrogen. It's got a hydrogen fuel cell on board. So hydrogen is becoming very much more prominent. I think it's a few years off being standard and kind of commercially available, but it's very much coming up there. Obviously we have battery powered technology as well, and there'll be different solutions for different applications, but ultimately we're going to be moving away from fossil fuels. But part of that is thinking about the infrastructure, of course. There's no point having a hydrogen powered vehicle if you've got no hydrogen petrol pump, in effect, hydrogen pump to fill it up. Thinking a bit outside the box, the example of barges there, river barges from Thames Tideway, is a really good innovative or different way of thinking about how to deal with some of their operations. The materials clearly are going to form part of your net zero reduction strategy. Think about all the embodied carbon of all those materials that you buy and engage with your supply chain to understand what goes into them. This talks to the EPD that was mentioned in one of the questions, BSE N15804. What are the embodied impacts of those materials and how can you reduce them? You know, simply using less is one option. Using a different kind of material that's got a lower embodied impact, using the same kind of material that comes from a different source. There's lots of different ways you can play the tunes on working this out. And it's not going to be solved overnight. As I say, it's going to be a work in progress as you can work with your design community, work with your architects to be more and more efficient. Simply thinking about recycled content, that's getting more prevalent as well, particularly in metals manufacturing. And then, as I say, the flip side to the materials and the machinery coin is the behaviours piece. It seems to be a rule of thumb that quite often, 50% of your impacts can be saved through efficient equipment, but the other 50% comes from the people who use that equipment and that they set it correctly, they use it correctly, so you get the optimum savings possible. So that's really, really important too, as part of that carbon reduction strategy. And then importantly, make sure you measure it. If you're aiming for net zero, you're going to have to measure it at some point to back up your claim, having the right data coming in and the performance measurement that goes with it. In this sense, the school's climate action group is a very good place to start. We have a measurement tool within that for gathering activity data, and then which then converts it into carbon emissions. Any members of the supply chain school who are supplying to partners, clients within the school are able to join and report data. So that's something else that we can promote for you. One example here, and there are many of them out there, where that kind of net zero carbon reduction mindset was taken in the design and construction of a building. This is just one example from the Northwest, the headquarters of the Cooperative Bank. They looked at a range of different techniques to reduce their energy demand fundamentally. So they're thinking about all the services and the equipment that go into that building, and then how they're used, but also where they've come from in terms of reducing that embodied carbon, the operational carbon, and then the downstream scope 3 carbon. And this just typifies the fact that there's lots of different aspects that can be brought into play to reach the same goal, that no one single action on its own is going to solve that, but there's lots of different Lego bricks that can all add up to the bigger picture. And you can see some of the output at the bottom in that final bullet, where there was some data on predicted reduction in carbon emission and energy use. I've yet to find the actual report, so if anyone knows of that one and is willing to share it, that'd be great, but I'm sure it's doing really well. As someone did point out though, they've got 3 rather large lighting rigs outside the front, and that's rather excessive if you're trying to reduce energy, but I suppose everyone's allowed a bit of artistic license. So what do we do with residual carbon? So we've gone through our carbon reduction strategy. We've got our baseline, we've measured it. We understand where the hotspots are for our carbon. You know, it could be our transport, it could be our manufacturing. That's where we're going to focus our reduction actions, more renewable materials, less material fundamentally, recycled content. But there's still going to be some carbon left over that we just can't get rid of at the moment because, as I said earlier, it's too financially expensive, or the technology isn't there, or we've literally just invested in some new equipment and we've got to let that have its lifetime before we replace it. So there's going to be some left over. And we've talked about carbon offsetting a little bit, and decarbonising, reducing carbon. But let's just jump back onto mentee for the third question. Get your opinion of this. If I move on to the next question. What's your opinion of carbon offsetting? A positive opinion? Somewhere in the middle? Or it's all a load of baloney? Just while you're voting, there's a question here from Tom about the shift to home working with the pandemic. More important now to decarbonise UK housing stock? Yes, definitely. Something like 80%, 85% of the UK's housing stock will still be there in 50 years' time, or massively high percentage. Obviously, we're building new housing, and there's the Future Home Standard is coming out the next year or so, which will look at particularly environmental impacts, carbon being one of them. But decarbonising the existing UK housing stock is probably more paramount, but just because of the numbers of houses, there's 85, 90% of them. And that retrofit agenda is really, really key. And clearly the Green Homes Grant, or the two versions of the Green Homes Grant, have not done so well, should we say. So something needs to be put in there. That's a really key issue we need to address. So the next question from Maurice: is an organisation responsible for the carbon emissions of its customers, e.g. the use of highways and transport alternatives? So this is your scope 3 downstream emissions. We've got another separate lunch and learn called scope busting, so that might be a useful one. So when we talk about our customers and what they emit, to them that's their scope 1 and 2 if they're using electricity or gas, for example, to run those facilities. But me as the person that sold them or given them that product or that service, is part of my scope 3 downstream emissions. So yes, I have a responsibility for that, and I'd account for that. So the house example is a very good one for that, where someone has sold a house and then the homeowner is using it to, you know, do the central heating and put lights on and so on. That is the homeowner's scope 1 and 2, but it's also the house builder's scope 3. Another example would be white goods. When we plug in a washing machine, someone like Hotpoint or Zanussi or Indesit, for them, it's their scope 3. When we plug in and use our washing machine at home, it's the scope 3 emissions of that manufacturer. Okay, results are in. 130 voters. Try and do quick mental maths. About half of you have said it can be a valid part of a carbon reduction strategy. 45 have said undecided, and a few of you think it's all greenwash. Yeah, it is. There have been lots of cases of greenwash. It's sadly, offsetting is a bit too easy to be open to abuse. Hence why you need to pick carefully when you choose, if you're going to do offsetting, choose the right provider. I suppose it's like anything in life. You need to do your market research. Don't just take the first one you're offered. Go in with your eyes open. But it is open to that. Okay, thank you. So what does carbon offsetting mean? As I said earlier, it's this net zero sum balance between emissions somewhere offset with emissions elsewhere. So imagine you're here and you've emitted some emissions, but you want to balance them off. That's it in simple terms. And there's a little picture there on the right hand side. So it's compensating for those greenhouse gas emissions that arise from an organisation or a product or even a project in one place, with the balance of a removal or reduction in greenhouse gas emissions somewhere else, because someone has done something that has reduced those emissions. And the way we do it as organisations is we invest. We don't actively go to that place and reduce those emissions for them. They do something, but our investment allows that to happen. Our financial investment allows them to do that work. And this is where some of the key issues come in, and we're going to come on to it in a second, about enabling that to happen, which otherwise wouldn't have happened. So it's comparing it to a business as usual situation. If you hadn't done that investment, business would have carried on as normal, but because you and others like you have made that investment, it's enabled that project or that scheme to do what it wants to do and reduce those emissions. But it's only through that financial investment that it's happened to change the business as usual. Otherwise it wouldn't have happened. And as I mentioned earlier, offsetting is now increasingly called compensation, to differentiate it between elimination or removal of carbon. So the benefits of carbon offsetting. You might have heard the polluter pays principle. It's a bit of a mouthful. That's been around as a phrase for a long, long time. It's just extending that to carbon and greenhouse gas emissions. That it gives you a level of responsibility. As you'll see, the cost of offsets is relatively low, so it's a rather cheap way of paying your way out of it, which hence why it's accused sometimes of greenwashing. But it is one mechanism to get organisations to think about paying for their pollution. At the scheme end, where they're trying to do that lower carbon project, lower carbon product, it gives them the investment to move forward on that, to move away from fossil fuels, to improve air quality. And with many offsetting schemes, there's concomitant other benefits. You're creating jobs, you're creating a better, lower air quality issues, so better healthcare issues, and all the well-being and health impacts that go with that. So it's quite often not just about carbon itself. You know, biodiversity, plantations is often part of that as well. So there's often concomitant benefits. And it is the final part, it can be the final part of a carbon reduction strategy. It doesn't have to be, it's not enshrined in law that you have to do this by any means, but it can be part of that. As I say, and this will be the mantra that you'll get bored of me saying, is once you've gone through all those other actions and you've done your best, then think about reducing your carbon through offsetting. So to be robust offsetting, and this is where the greenwashing often comes in, where you get double counting, or you're just missold something that just doesn't exist. It's just simply a fiction, it's a lie. You're given sent a picture on the internet of a forest somewhere and you sign up to it, and before you know it, that forest doesn't exist. So it's really about doing your due diligence into those schemes and working out what's best for you, obviously what you can afford, but the robustness of those schemes. And there's various different ways you can test those schemes. Stating the obvious, they need to be real, they can't be fictitious, and there are many examples of where there have been fictitious forest plantations and schemes that investing in local economies and so on that just don't exist. They're just fictitious. So they need to be verifiable and traceable. You need to have some mechanism, or the organization you invest with need to have a clear and transparent mechanism that you can test that they are verifiable and real and traceable. A bit like tracing your beef back to the farm. It has to be that supply chain due diligence that goes with it. They need to be additional, and that means this is the business as usual bit here. If that thing was going to happen anyway, if there was a government grant that scheme was going to get anyway, and they were going to do their activity, your extra investment is not helping them get out of the starting blocks. So your investment in an offset needs to be additional to what would have happened otherwise. So it needs to change it from the business as usual. In other words, if you and other people like you didn't invest, that scheme wouldn't happen. You wouldn't get the carbon benefits from it. So it has to be additional to what's happening anyway. So this is where some of the criticism is levied at hydroelectric schemes, for example, because quite often they were going to happen anyway. Someone's going to put in a hydroelectric scheme with government funding, and they get a bit of a top-up funding from this, but they were still going to happen anyway. So there's no kind of additional benefit from the offsetting investment. They need to be measurable. Ultimately, someone's going to say, I want to buy credits for X 100 tons of carbon. So someone somewhere needs to measure how much carbon has been reduced compared to that business as usual. So there needs to be a bit of maths going into gathering the data. And they need to be permanent. Again, this is where some of the greenwashing happens, which is the negative side of it, where a scheme is put up and it might actually exist, it might be real, it might be verifiable and traceable, but it vanishes after a couple of years. The land is sold on for something else, and all the investment that went into that offset is lost. So it needs to be permanent, and there's various rules about permanence of those different schemes. So the mnemonic for that for me is RAMP. You can make your own mnemonic if you want, but for me, RAMP works. It's a good way of remembering those 4 key issues. And in terms of the scheme that backs, or the mechanism that backs these different schemes, they need to be clear as well. So when you go to a third party that deals in different schemes and credits and offsets and so on, they need to be independent, transparent, verifiable, inclusive, all the things you'd look for in a scheme that you're investing in the same way that you'd look at timber schemes for chain of custody or other chains of custody schemes. That's essentially what you're looking at. It's the same kind of governance that you need to include. So some of the kinds of examples of offsetting projects, and they cover the whole carbon hierarchy in terms of the kinds of activities they do. You can get schemes that avoid or switch in terms of their carbon. So it's provision of renewable energy, whether it's solar panels, for example, compared to fossil fuels. So what you're saying is, had we not invested in this scheme, we'd have just carried on burning diesel in a generator, but we know that we can invest in solar PV, and that takes away the need for the diesel generation. So we've made an offset, we've made a difference. You can reduce the amount that happens anyway. So a good example there is capturing methane from digestion plants. Methane is far, far worse for global warming than carbon dioxide. But if you capture that methane and use it as a fuel source and produce CO2, that's far better than letting that methane be released to the atmosphere and then still having to source your power from somewhere else. So you are making a net gain, a net benefit in your carbon emissions. And there's efficient equipment, efficient drinking water supplies and transport. And then there's also the capture piece, the reforestation and afforestation, carbon capture and storage. This is where offsetting overlaps with carbon removal. And I'm sure we've all seen schemes where you plant 1,000 trees, plant 1,000,000 trees, and it will capture the carbon for you. On average, a given tree will absorb about a ton of carbon dioxide over its lifetime, over 100 years. So because of that time scale, that's where the permanence bit in the slide above is really important. If someone puts in a plantation of trees and claims offsets and then 10 years later chops it all down, you haven't gained that benefit. So that's why the permanence needs to be part of it, as well as the scheme being verifiable and traceable. So just a clarification on some of those terms: reforestation and afforestation. Reforestation is where you have an existing forest that's been fragmented and there's some of it still standing, but you reforest, you put back what was taken away. Afforesting is starting from scratch where there wasn't or hasn't for a very, very long time been any forest. So you're putting it back from scratch, but essentially it's tree planting. In terms of the practicalities of how you measure your offsets, this is where the business as usual comes in. So you might say that your emissions in the blue line, the one that gradually goes up, are for your business as usual, if you were just to carry on as normal and do nothing. But then you might say, what are we going to, we're going to put something in place, we're going to do some offsets, we're going to have some different technology, we're going to have some different ways of working. And then we predict that the emissions from the project that's offset is in the orange line, the lower line, over time, because we've made a difference. And it's always comparing to that business as usual. And this is where those mechanisms and schemes will do the calculation as to what would have happened otherwise. There's lots of ifs and woulds and what would have happened. And then you do a calculation, and that yellow shape represents the amount of carbon that is saved, that is avoided through the activity that they've undertaken. And then simply, in terms of how you calculate all that, when you worked out how many tons of carbon you've avoided, 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent becomes 1 carbon credit or 1 offset. For those who don't recognize CO2e, the E stands for equivalent, because we're looking at all greenhouse gases here, not just carbon dioxide. So there's a way to convert other greenhouse gases like methane and nitrous oxide into carbon dioxide equivalents. So that's what that E stands for. So how much does offsetting cost? There's a whole variety of different schemes out there, and they all vary in price. But if you look across different schemes, you'll see prices similar to what are on the screen now. They're always in US dollars. If you want to convert to pounds, divide those numbers by about 1.3. So maybe you're looking at about £7 a ton for a renewable energy scheme, something like 11 or 12 pounds a ton for cook stoves, and so on. Some of them can be really expensive, and essentially the scheme will work out how much money it takes to invest and develop that scheme, whether it's putting in PV panels or manufacturing cooking stoves that burn more cleanly and efficiently rather than kerosene stoves, and then compare that to the amount of carbon dioxide that's saved. And then you can do the sums and work out how much it is per ton to buy that offset, essentially. But there's a whole range of them out there, and when you look into them, they're the other benefits that I was talking about. So that the cook stoves is very much about cleaner air and better health outcomes for those people using them. Planting trees is obviously got a biodiversity aspect to it. Many of them have got local and social community and jobs and employment involved in them as well. In terms of offsetting, there are 2 main options, 2 types of option. There's the UN's Clean Development Mechanism, run by the United Nations, and this is global. It's backed by the UN and all the governments that are party to the Kyoto Protocol from the mid-90s. It's all public. There's a public registry and a database, and it's very clear governance in terms of who assesses, who validates, who checks all the numbers and so on. These are very much limited to developing nations. It can't be anywhere globally because we're trying to drive social benefit as well as climate benefit as well. And when you get one of these, it's called a certified emission reduction certificate. They all have slightly different names. The other main option are these private voluntary mechanisms, and they are businesses. They run a business selling offsets to organizations who are looking for offsets. I've included the three main ones here. There are others, but these are three robust schemes that are available. As I said earlier, not all schemes are equivalent, so you need to check for RAMP, but the gold standard, the verified carbon standard and Plan Vivo are all pretty solidly robust in terms of using the way they do their governance, the transparency that they have. And there's a slight difference between these, the way these are run, and the UN CDM in terms of whether you disclose publicly or not, how long the verification is valid for. They can be anywhere in the world. They don't have to be developing nations. So you can see there's a slight difference here as well. But if you were to choose offsets, think about obviously the robustness, the RAMP of those schemes, but then think about some of those other aspects as well. Where in the world would you want to invest? Would you want to be in the UK or Europe or somewhere else? And they all have slightly different names for what their offsets are called. Okay, so in terms of the last couple of slides, we've talked about offsetting. So that's where you're still emitting. You're not getting away from that, you're still emitting, but you want to kind of invest in a scheme that's reducing its emissions. So overall net zero balance. There's no carbon emissions because your investment has balanced out your emissions, but you're still emitting. You can't get away from that. You're offsetting, that's great, but you still have to report your absolute emissions. Even if you have a separate column somewhere that says, yes, we've bought some offsets, you still have to report the actual emissions that you have actually made nonetheless. Greenhouse gas removal goes one stage further than offsetting. It is about actually removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So this is where the overlap is that I was talking about earlier. It's more than just compensating, it is actual removal. There's lots of different technologies and routes that you can deliver this through, and it's what's required for true deep decarbonisation. So when you speak to various organisations that I mentioned earlier, this is where we're getting to in terms of where our investments should be shifting to. So just to give you a flavour of some of those routes to decarbonisation and actual GHG removal, some of these are similar as you saw with the offsetting slide, so afforestation and reforestation, but again, they've got to be permanent for a long time. Otherwise, it's lost in effect. You can do similarly with wetlands and peatland. Peat bogs are known for being really, really good for absorbing carbon dioxide. The kelp grasses in shores, ocean shores, are far better at absorbing carbon dioxide, far quicker at absorbing carbon dioxide than trees are. So investment in sea habitat, natural sea habitats, is really driving carbon removal. It also provides biodiversity space and habitat for marine life as well. So there's a win-win. So if you're going to invest in anything, for me, it's got that kind of wetland coastal restoration. Management techniques in agriculture bring in more carbon dioxide into land management techniques, so we're not producing so much carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases through the way that we do agriculture. And over time, there will be schemes that are available to invest in that are all part of this as well, in the way that we do currently with offsetting, but there'll be greenhouse gas removal schemes implicitly. And then we step up how detailed we get. We can not only absorb the carbon dioxide into trees, but we can make things out of wood. We do this already, but it's making sure that those products are permanent again, or permanent for a considerable amount of time. Whether it's building products, you might have heard of biochar, which is a bit like charcoal. It's taking wood and it's treating it into a substance that holds on to its carbon for a long time. It doesn't readily degrade, it doesn't rot down quickly. That can be stored, or it can be built into agricultural practices, and it locks away the carbon. It's taken it out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis, and then it's locked away in the earth. And then you can get into more technical. You've heard of carbon capture and storage, and there's different ways of removing carbon through carbon capture and storage. There's bioenergy carbon capture and storage, BECCS, that's using it from plant life and going through a process capturing that carbon after you've consumed the wood through power provision. So you get your energy, you get your electricity, but then the carbon dioxide that comes out from that is stored away. So you're actually getting a net carbon removal from the atmosphere. It's removed by the tree growing, but rather than just emitting the same amount back into the atmosphere when you burn it, you're locking that away, so you've got a net saving. And as you can see, there's 3 different ways of doing that, whether that's locking it away underground in old coal mines, or through the absorption into concrete or different routes. And then there's a more technical version, DACS, direct air capture and carbon storage, where there's plant and equipment that will pull CO2 out of the air and then store it. This is more nascent. There are examples around the world, but they're fairly small scale at this stage, but it is possible. And you can also attach it to the back end of other production processes, such as steel production, where CO2 is produced as a byproduct, and you capture that CO2 and lock it away before it gets into the atmosphere, pressurize it, liquefy it, and then lock it away. So there are various different techniques. But as I say, this is taking offsetting and going even further into removal and elimination. So just to remind you of your carbon reduction strategy to net zero, having these 5 main steps is really key. And making sure you do that along the way, and offsetting is part of that, or even better, as I say, greenhouse gas removal is really part of that process as we move forward to a more and more lower carbon society. Okay, so final poll, final question of the 4. What's your next action on carbon? If I just flip over, final question for you, and then we'll let you go. Rank your next actions on carbon. So what you should see on your screen are, it'll say choose your first out of those, and then choose your second, choose your third, and you can rank them in terms of what you think you'd like to be doing. Just while you're doing that, I see Sophie's posted the link in the chat box for the feedback. Apologies, it's not SurveyMonkey anymore. It's called forms.office.com, part of the Microsoft fleet. Just while you're putting in your answers, some good questions from Tom here. Kiss the Dirt documentary on Netflix speaks about how to remove carbon through better agriculture and soil management. Yes, there's definitely a movement for no tillage, no dig, because the whole process of ploughing and disturbing the soil releases a huge amount of greenhouse gas emissions, particularly methane. Whereas if there's a move to have a no dig policy, it would lock away a lot more greenhouse gas emissions. How do we know these organisations will still exist in 100 years? Well, yes, very good point. If they want to be sustainable as an organisation, yeah, they need to likewise make sure they do all the right things to still be in business themselves. Just refreshing mentee. There we go. Thank you. Set a carbon reduction target and strategy and put actions in place. Definitely, yes. I was being a bit childish there. I put quite a few actions in there, but yes, understanding what you need to do and where you need to act is really key in this. Biggest bang for your buck is very much the right attitude here. Cool. Okay, I'll just try and pick up a couple more questions. Thank you very much, everybody. If you need to drop off for another call, I'm sure we've all got back-to-backs or lunch to go to, then thank you for attending and listening. I'll try and answer some of the questions in the last couple of minutes. Antonio's got a question about useful tools for carbon to project emissions if we didn't move towards EVs and heat pumps. I don't know of a specific tool, but I'm sure you could very much, if you had, let's say EVs, vehicles, for example, understand your fleet mix and what your average fuel consumption would be for that fleet mix if it were to remain petrol and diesel as opposed to EV. You can use various carbon calculator tools out there that exist already that give you the emission factors for, you know, a diesel van versus an electric van that's being plugged into the grid. So an electric van, of course, will still have some greenhouse gas emissions because it's pulling from the grid, but a lot less than a diesel. Should also think about the embodied carbon as well, though. So the embodied emissions of an electric vehicle are generally a bit higher than the diesel equivalent, but over the lifetime it's lower because the manufacturing might be higher, but by the time you get to the whole life cost, the diesel emissions have overtaken. So you need to think about that a little bit as well. Okay. So there's a question about tree planting doesn't fit into carbon offsetting. It does, definitely. Tree planting is an overlap between offsetting and carbon removal schemes. Cool. Any more questions? Yeah, the permanent seems to be coming up a couple of times here in terms of working with the scheme. The best you can do is engage with those offsetting schemes that I talked about earlier and how they ensure through their governance that a scheme is permanent. And let me just flip back. They give different years to how long that will be. Let's get back up. So on those two main options, this one here, which is the voluntary markets, they look for forestry up to 100 years. So that's giving some giving the confidence and credibility that that plantation will be safeguarded through time. Yes, there was a comment there about being logged, but then surely you shouldn't be selling it to someone who's going to log it. A forest fire is a slightly different thing if that's accidental or even deliberate arson. But the scheme's working with the people on the ground to make sure that they don't sell it off for logging, essentially. Excellent. Thank you very much, everybody. I'll try and answer some of those other questions offline, but we've reached 2 o'clock. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your interaction, and have a good afternoon. Thank you.